Lawman Eliot Ness, leader of the Untouchables. Legend has it, he stopped Al Capone. Not exactly. This was the last ride of the Untouchables. Their mission? Escort a convicted Capone to Chicago's Dearborn Station, where a train and some U.S. Marshals would take him to an Atlanta penitentiary. Eliot Ness was somewhere in the crowd, but the cameras followed Big Al. Ness was never singled out, and that's no accident. The truth is, Eliot Ness was not the man who brought Al Capone down. He was the man who brought Al Capone down to the train station.
There's more myths about Eliot Ness than there are about Loch Ness. Ness was a hard-working, honest Prohibition agent, but he did not single-handedly put Al Capone away.
In truth, Eliot Ness was the ultimate writer's embellishment. A real man behind a book, a TV series, and a movie that were mostly pulp fiction. And America bought it, and bought it, and bought it. The real Eliot Ness was full of contradictions. A moral crusader, yet a shameless press hound. A Prohibition agent who loved his scotch. A family man who was never home. An honest man who became intoxicated by fame and would chase it the rest of his life. When Eliot Ness chose to become a federal Prohibition agent, he put himself on a collision course with America's #1 bootlegger, Al Capone. Every day, thousands of barrels of Capone's product rolled untouched into speakeasies and gambling dens. There were a few crackdowns, but they were mostly just for show and had little impact. Chicagoans loved their booze, and most, including Eliot Ness, thought the Volstead Act, known as Prohibition, was a misguided law.
He thought it was damn foolishness. He thought people, as long as they used it moderately, should have the beer. What was the phrase he used to use? Legislate against human nature was his term for what Prohibition was.
Eliot Ness was known to enjoy a drink or two, dating back as far as his college days when he was a member of a college fraternity. I think it's a pretty safe bet that even during Prohibition, he was one of many millions of Americans who were enjoying an occasional drink.
But Ness never publicly questioned the law, and he had sworn to uphold it. Further, he had no use for the arrogance of Al Capone. The silk-suited gangster laughed at the law. His rackets grossed well over $100 million a year, most of it from bootlegging. Capone spent hundreds of thousands of it bribing Prohibition agents, making enforcement efforts feeble. Ness was embarrassed by it. As was his boss, U.S. Attorney George E.Q. Johnson. The prosecutor had gotten orders directly from President Herbert Hoover to do something about Chicago's alcohol problem.
The question was, how do we actually gather evidence against Capone? This was a huge obstacle that blocked Johnson's path to getting Capone. The fact that the people that had to actually go out and get the evidence couldn't be trusted.
But Johnson had a master plan, a flank attack.
They were going to hit Capone from two different directions. The Treasury Department was going to collect information on Capone's tax evasion, and then the Prohibition Bureau was going to collect evidence that would be used to prosecute him for violating the Volstead Act.
Each investigation would be run by a very small hand-picked task force. The key was that the squads had to be absolutely honest. For a recommendation on who could lead the Prohibition squad, Johnson called a trusted advisor, Justice Agent Alexander Jamie, the brother-in-law of Eliot Ness. With little hesitation, Jamie recommended Eliot. Ness was just 26 years old and straight as an arrow. Johnson hired him and detailed his assignment. Ness's team would hit Capone most directly by locating his breweries and smashing them, therefore thinning out Big Al's wallet and reducing his ability to bribe cops and politicians. In addition, Johnson hoped the raids would restore some public confidence in law enforcement, and with any luck, might divert Capone's attention from the taxmen. Johnson knew the tax case would be his best bet to get the gangster. Chicago loved its booze, but there was much less sympathy for a tax cheat. So while he needed the Prohibition Squad to be effective, ultimately it was the decoy. For Eliot Ness, it was a terrific opportunity, and he approached it with a zealot's purpose. He put together a team of 9 men, none older than 30, and each with a specialized skill, including a wiretapper, a lockman, and a car-tailing expert. All had impeccable reputations for honesty, which would later give them their name, the Untouchables. In September of 1929, they began.
They started out looking for Capone breweries. Well, just where do we find these things? They essentially backtracked from the saloons. When the saloons sell the beer, the kegs then are put out and back. The kegs are eventually picked up by a truck and taken back to the breweries to be reused. So if you watch every step in the process long enough, you will eventually find your way back to a brewery.
But when Ness and his men raided the brewery, they encountered some difficulties. It took several minutes to break through the specially reinforced doors, which Ness would learn Capone had installed in most of his locations.
By the time they finally got through the brewery doors, everybody had fled. I think he was a little disenchanted that there was no one there to arrest, that there was just some beer.
In their first 6 months, all the raids followed suit. The Untouchables seized nearly $1 million worth of bootlegging equipment, barely a scratch for the Capone organization. They didn't make a single arrest. Ness needed more inside information about how the operation really ran, so he decided to tap the phones of top Capone henchmen like Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik and Al's big brother, Ralph Capone. It was a bold investigative move for the times and a dangerous one. Capone had lookouts everywhere. Ness himself stood guard while his wiretap expert, Paul Robsky, put in the tap on Ralph Capone's phones. But the risks would be worth it. As the information poured in, Ness transcribed some of the tapes by hand. There were details on brewery locations, how many barrels would be shipped to which bars and when. He took the information and combined it with another innovation, a specially designed truck outfitted with a snowplow that served as a battering ram. Now, the brewery doors came down without delay. At a raid on June 13th, 1930, they arrested 6 men, took 2 trucks, and destroyed equipment valued at $25,000. Newspapers picked up the story, and Elliot kept the clippings in his personal scrapbook. But the raid, and Eliot Ness for that matter, were of little interest to Al Capone himself.
I'm not so sure that it wasn't more of a diversion to Al Capone, maybe an annoyance, than it was a serious threat that Capone had to worry about. He had many other things to worry about at the time, from rival gangsters to the tax case.
And the taxmen were making progress. IRS agent Frank Wilson had located some of Capone's secret ledgers, detailing parts of his illicit income. Now, all Wilson needed was to tie Capone directly to the ledgers. He needed to find the accountant who had written the books. But Eliot Ness, caught up in the biggest crime investigation in the country, felt that life was rushing by. He had met the woman he wanted to marry. Her name was Edna Staley. She was Alexander Jamie's secretary. Within months of dating, Eliot proposed, and she accepted. But because of his work, they put the wedding on hold.
This was unfortunately a time of his life where the scales had to tip or tilt in the direction of chasing Al Capone at the expense of his personal relations with the woman he would later marry.
By late in the summer of 1930, Ness's raids began to have some impact on Capone. So much so that the gangster sent an associate to Ness's office in Chicago's transportation building with an offer of $2,000 every week if Ness would relax his still busting. At the time, Ness's annual salary was just $2,900. His response was telling.
Ness at that moment was enraged that he'd be offered a bribe, and he took the money and stuffed it back into the young mobster's pockets, literally threw him out of the office, and that pretty much summed up what Ness was all about, the fact that he couldn't be corrupted.
When his money was rejected, Capone tried scaring Ness.
He was once almost run down by a car. He had a couple shots fired at him once while he was, when he was getting out of his car.
Capone, would do things like that. He was a master at chicanery. He was a master at intimidation.
I frankly doubt if Ness was in great danger. The Capone gangsters were smart businessmen, whatever else they were, and I think they would have realized that there's no percentage in killing a federal agent.
Nevertheless, the intimidation took its toll. Elliot worried about Edna's safety and would stay clear of her during particularly tense times. There would be months when the two would not see each other. Ness pressed on with his raids, and his scrapbook filled out. Reporters didn't know Ness was leading a secret squad against Capone, just that he was a rare Prohibition agent out actually doing his job.
And if he was going to do a major raid, he didn't just sneak in. He made sure that the media was there to cover it every whack of the axe.
He was such an egotist. But any time an investigator tells the press ahead of time that I'm going to raid 1010 North State Street, so that they're there at the time he comes in and he gets headlines, it's not exactly a good way to get convictions.
But U.S. Attorney Johnson never ordered Ness to knock off the press relations, likely because it created the public impression that work was being done against Capone.
Ness, I think, really wanted to give the public a hero that was opposite Capone, somebody who was incorruptible, who wasn't tainted, and who was out there dealing for the public good.
But Eliot Ness's cultivated image and the reality of his successes would soon part ways.